Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I'm going to read from a book, the full title of the book. If you're watching this on one of my channels, you'll see a guy by the name of Felix Yusupov. And the book he wrote is called Rasputin, His Malignant Influence and His Assassination. And you'll see a different spelling of his name. It's Prince Yusupov here, Youssupoff. That was the fashion at the time. Now it's Yusupov. And he was really a first person. This is the person who took credit for killing Rasputin, Gregory Rasputin. A lot of stuff that happened in Russia before the breakdown, the revolution, the October Revolution in 1917. But his whole class was pretty much annihilated. They had to there was the Revolutionary War in Russia between what's called the whites and the reds. And his whole class was either murdered or had to leave the country. He had to leave Russia. He was really on par with the Romanovs. Like they were, I don't think the Yusupov family was a royal family, but they were very, very wealthy. He was educated. His story about this guy in itself is actually worth an episode, but that's for another time. I really just want to get through this book. And if you've listened to my shows about mind control, hypnotism, occultism, and world events, this will resonate with you for sure. Granted, these stories and what he's told are obviously self-serving to a certain extent, but he is a first-person account. You almost never hear this from the left. If you went to a state school or something like that, this book doesn't even exist because this is a class traitor of the first order. Very wealthy family, privileged, Oxford, had English intel ties. There's no question about it. And that's another aspect of the Rasputin death that is really an interesting element, is how much involvement outside forces were in the destabilization and tampering and meddling with the internal affairs of Russia, much like the United States. There's a lot of parallels. And I think this will be part of a series on the Russian Revolution, what took place after the turn of the century. I've done shows on the 1905 upheaval, and this first person account. He also knows Nicholas II. He knows his wife. He knew firsthand the kind of mechanics that went on with Nicholas II, the last Tsar, Nicholas the Last, so to speak, the Romanovs who were murdered in 1917, the whole family. But it's just an interesting part of history in itself and worth reading. So I'll break it down into hourly segments. So I'll do an hour today. And for people who don't know, I've probably done 30 or 40 hours in total on my podcast, which is just simply William Ramsey Reads History. So it's a breakdown out of my main podcast, William Ramsey Investigates, of all the history books that I've read over time, probably over the last 5, 10 years, 7 years. I've done My Confession, Recollections of a Rogue by Samuel Chamberlain. I've covered the life of Richard Burton, psychological analysis of Adolf Hitler, Josephus' Wars of the Jews, Man-Eaters of Savo, and The Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Diaz, which is one of my favorite history books, if not my favorite history book of all time, really is. Bernal Diaz's recollection of the conquest of Spain under Hernan Cortez. Just an incredible book. Should be taught everywhere, especially for people in North America. But again, I'll put a link to that. I'll put a link to that series of episodes. I have 42 episodes so far. This will probably take time, and then I'll follow this up with some of the other first-person accounts of Rasputin, one from his daughter, one of his own writings, how unusual he was. But I think this Prince Yusupov's take is very deft and approaches the subtlety of who this person Rasputin was, and what an effect he had upon the royal family, really, who was a feudal aristocrat. I think that the serf system in Russia only ended or was changed in like 1860. So you had this mass of seemingly peasant, I guess a peasant class is really a fair way and accurate way to say it up until the mid 19th century. So it was ripe for different ideas, and much different than what happened in the United States, where I think the egalitarianism was more pronounced in the 19th century. It's not anymore. We're headed back to maybe a new serfdom, which I think is fair, or neo feudal. They call it neo feudalism. It may just be some type of new form of feudalism in the United States where people can't afford anything anymore. But so I think that these upheavals, these are social upheavals. And the Russian Revolution was much like the French Revolution, inequality, a kind of detached elite, in my opinion. And there's a lot of different views on this, but I do think this first person account by Prince Yusupov is important. And like I said, he's worthy of his own kind of historical analysis. He's a really remarkable character, and the story is remarkable. I don't think it's very well told, frankly. So I think that this is one aspect, kind of maybe just blowing the dust off history, that people should hear. So, like I said, check out History Books Read by William Ramsey. You can just check that out on my podcast or just type it into Google search. And then this will be just 1 hour in a series that I will do on this one book. And again, the full title is Rasputin, His Malignant Influence and His Assassination. Prince Yusupov, published 1927. So this version is out of copyright. It is interesting that this guy, here's another picture of him. Let's see if we can get this out. He's much more of a different character than what he shows when he's up in a suit and tie. He's a little bit of, I guess, a rich hellraiser, maybe is a way to put it. Flamboyant and international, had a lot of different types of friends, things like that. But like I said, I'll just get started with the contents. And I just want to be true to the text. Like, I know that every kind of history book has its own angle or maybe its own bias. You can't get rid of bias. It's not possible. But I do think this is worthwhile. And here goes. One more time. Full title: Rasputin, His Malignant Influence and His Assassination, by Prince Yusupov. Preface. I have hitherto hesitated to publish my recollections of Rasputin. I have been anxious to avoid making untimely reference to events which were faithfully connected with the reign of the martyred Emperor Nicholas II. Certain sections of the press, however, continue to publish misleading and calumnious articles on this subject. And too often, even Russians, alas, gratify the morbid curiosity of the crowd with versions which are no less inexact. Malicious scoffing at the expense of those who have atoned with their blood for all their involuntary errors is inadmissible. Yet in respect to our recent past, there is another extreme, an exaggerated idealization of the last reign with all its unhealthy features. These two extremes hinder in equal degree a sober and objective analysis of the past. They exert a particularly harmful influence on our younger generation, who are now growing up far away from the fatherland, but are destined sooner or later to take part in the building up of a new Russia. We have no right to fill our children's minds with vague legends. These will not suffice to imbue them with a real love of the fatherland and a sense of duty towards it. It is important, moreover, that we should recognize errors committed in the past. We may thus avoid many a pitfall and provide against many a disappointment in the future. Such are the motives which impel me, as an eyewitness of some of these tragic events which occurred around the throne, to give a true account of all that I saw and heard. And I have resolved to overcome that heaviness of heart which possesses me whenever I touch upon the past, especially when I dwell upon the terrible sequel in the cellar of Ipatievsky House at Ekaterinburg. Introduction. The whole country was seething with indignation while Rasputin, like a dark shadow, stood near the throne. The best representatives of the clergy raised their voices in defense of the church and of Russia against the intrigues of this criminal upstart. Persons most closely associated with the royal family implored the emperor and the empress to dismiss him. But all was in vain. His influence grew stronger and stronger, and as it grew, the feeling of discontent in the country increased, spreading even to the remotest districts, where the simple peasantry, with true instinct, felt that there was something wrong with the fountainhead of power. And so, when Rasputin was killed, his death was acclaimed with general rejoicing. Since then, however, a change of opinion has perhaps taken place. Stunned by the horrors of the revolution, harassed by the hardships of exile, Russians have forgotten much of the past. The Soviet government has turned our country into such an inferno that any other political and social regime seems a paradise in comparison. The domination of the Third International has revealed to the whole world the lengths to which crime may go. Everything pales beside the Soviet torture chambers, in which all the technique of the 20th century has been applied in the infliction of the most excruciating physical and mental agonies. Oppressed by this nightmare, the Russian refugee is sometimes apt to make an unwarrantable comparison between communist Russia and pre-revolutionary Russia. And he concludes that a score of Rasputins would have been preferable to the destruction of the old order of things. It seems to him now that opposition to Rasputin and to his influence was in itself a revolutionary movement, that his assassination was the first shot, the signal and incentive for a coup d'etat, and that if people had only reconciled themselves to him and left him alone, the terrible upheaval which has laid waste to the whole country would have been averted. Such childish reasoning can only be explained by the reaction which is set in. Reaction can be just as blind and intolerant as revolution. The revolution was not the result of Rasputin's death. Its causes were to be found at a much earlier date. They lay in Rasputin himself, in the unscrupulous and cynical betrayal of Russia, in Rasputinism, that tangle of dark intrigue, egoistic self-seeking, hysterical madness, and vainglorious pursuit of power, which wrapped the throne in an impenetrable web and isolated the monarch from his people. Among those who openly stood their stand against this baneful influence were the Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorovna, sister of the young empress, the Metropolitan Anthony of St. Petersburg and Lagoda, the Metropolitan Vladimir M. Samarin, the head of the Holy Synod, M. Stolypin, the former prime minister, and M. Rodzianko, president of the Duma. Can any tongue be found to condemn these as traitors and enemies of their country? Yet they were convinced opponents of Rasputin. They resisted him in the name of their faith, Tsar, and fatherland, in order to save Russia from revolution. Deprived of all possibility of knowing what was happening in Russia, the emperor could not distinguish between friend and foe. All unsuspecting, he trusted those who were driving both the throne and Russia to their doom, and refused the aid of those who could have helped him to save the country and the dynasty. There is no doubt that the Emperor Nicholas II was called upon to reign during a period beset with anxieties. For many decades, Russia had been undermined by the destructive work of hidden revolutionary organizations, directed and amply financed from abroad. The revolutionary movement waxed and waned, but never for a moment ceased. The government were forced to take up a defensive position. To maintain that position without exciting and provoking public opinion was very difficult, indeed almost impossible. The public resented the so-called repressions and felt it their duty to support the most extreme tendencies, not realizing the danger thereby incurred. After the firm rule of Emperor Alexander III, who had suppressed revolutionary manifestations, it was hoped that his successor would allow the public to take a greater share in state affairs. At the beginning of his reign, the Emperor Nicholas II declined to make any concessions whatever, but his self-appointed task of preserving intact the foundations of autocracy was incompatible with his personal characteristics. The people were always willing to submit to one in whom they feel strength and firmness. All Russia instinctively divined the young emperor's deficiency in these qualities. The revolutionary organization seized the first opportunity to assert themselves, and the unfavorable issue of the unpopular Russo-Japanese War induced still wider circles to advocate open action. The first revolutionary storm broke out over Russia in 1905. It was successfully quelled. Outwardly, peace was restored, but revolutionary propaganda continued slowly to undermine the authority of the Tsar. Among the peasants, the agrarian disturbances of 1905 and the revolutionary slogan, Land and Freedom, awakened to dark instincts of anarchy and a thirst for possession. Workmen, especially in the big industrial centers, could not forget the appeal against capital. As, regard the, as regards the educated classes, those who were inclined towards the left began to dream of a democratic republic tinged with socialism, while more moderate elements were attracted towards the extreme form of parliamentary government. The wealthy bourgeoisie strove after power and political influence in the country. The vast majority of the younger members of the intelligentsia, especially the students, raved about revolution, often converting the university lecture rooms into places for political meetings. Young and old alike looked upon revolution as a supreme blessing and the sole means of restoring social justice and general prosperity in Russia. This naive and visionary idealism on the part of the Russian intelligentsia transformed revolution into something very like a religion, an inspiration for deeds of heroism and self sacrifice. It had its own saints, political criminals exiled to Siberia or in hiding abroad, especially assassins of the terrorist type, were looked upon as heroes worthy of the greatest reverence. The Russian educated public of that time was affected by some kind of mental derangement, which was reflected both in literature and in journalism. Highly cultivated and respected people often showed themselves quite incapable of understanding the basis of the political life of the country. They subjected the whole of the existing order of things to the most bitter and one sided criticism, and with a lack of insight which was almost infantile, they practically ignored the incontestable services rendered to Russia by her czars, who, in the course of centuries, had built up a mighty empire. Hence, a quite erroneous idea of monarchical Russia was formed in foreign countries also. Yet at the outbreak of the Great War, Russia presented a spectacle of amazing prosperity. Her finances were in brilliant order. Industry and agriculture were developing with fabulous speed. New railways were under construction. The scope of national education was being widened. A number of state departments could be considered as models of their kind. But at that time, the intelligentsia, who influenced public opinion by means of the press and of the Duma, were not disposed to reckon with practical facts. They placed abstract political theories before everything else. They held it to their primary duty to sap the bulwarks of autocracy, losing no opportunity of holding up its defects before the public. Whenever disaster looms ahead, circumstances seem to unfold themselves in such a way as to precipitate it. At that time, certain events were happening in the imperial entourage, which provided abundant grounds for the most distressing misunderstandings of every kind, and roused a feeling of discontent throughout the country. The private life of the Tsar's family was fatefully interwoven with the course of political events. The personal characteristics of the Emperor Nicholas II and of the Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna might not, perhaps under other conditions, have exercised any noticeable influence of their reign. But those characteristics did, as a fact, play a tragic part in the fate of Russia and of the whole dynasty. The Emperor Nicholas II, as heir to the throne, received an excellent education, but he did not have time to prepare himself for the difficult and many-sided duties of a monarch. The Emperor Alexander III, who had held the reins of power firmly in his own strong hands, died in the flower of life, and the burden of autocracy fell upon the youthful and inexperienced Tsarevich. When the young emperor brought his bride, the Princess Alice of Hesse, to St. Petersburg, it was to follow his father's coffin. And the princess, draped in mourning from the moment of arrival in Russia, was deprived of the possibility of making preliminary acquaintance with her new country, its society and traditions and customs. Other Russian empresses like as Tsarevny had gradually familiarized themselves with Russian conditions and had made the acquaintance of their future subjects in a more simple surroundings. But the wife of the Emperor Nicholas II stepped straight into the imperial role to occupy that exalted position which demands wide experience of the people governed, yet offers few facilities for gaining it. Society and the nation as a whole had their eyes fixed on the unknown young empress, with an interest that could not but be embarrassing to her. Nervous and sensitive, she withdrew into herself. She gave an impression of reserve, coldness, occasionally even of discourtesy. Her popularity was thus prejudiced at the outset, especially as she was constantly being compared with the Dowager Empress Marie Fyodorovna, who was beloved by everyone in Russia. Nor was the early married life of the imperial couple bathed in that carefree happiness which their position under different circumstances would have ensured. The Emperor Nicholas II was called upon to bear the twin load of his beloved father's loss and all the anxieties and responsibilities of the Russian crown. The Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna sincerely desired to share his burden. She offered him advice which, owing to her very limited knowledge of Russia, may not always have been sound. She thus acquired from the very first the habit of exercising an influence in state affairs. This did not meet with public approval. It drew forth comments on the emperor's weakness of will, while the empress was censured for her love of power. The young empress soon realized that she had failed to gain real sympathy in her new country, in any case among the higher ranks of St. Petersburg society. She became more and more sensitive and nervous, and retired still further into private life, feeling that her good intentions were neither understood nor appreciated. She was sometimes inclined to attribute her unpopularity in the country to the fact that four daughters in succession were born to her instead of the long awaited son and heir. Misfortunes such as the Japanese War, the outbreaks of terrorism, and the events of 1905 exercised a profound influence on her state of mind. After she had embraced the Orthodox faith, she began, with the zeal and exaltation of a novice, to perform all its outward ceremonies, but she failed to penetrate into its deep and intricate spiritual meaning. Deeply religious by nature, as time went on, she became more and more steeped in mysticism. She soon became attracted by the dark mysteries of occult forces, by spiritualism, and by every form of magic. She showed an interest in fanatics, soothsayers, clairvoyants. When a French occultist, a certain Dr. Philippe, made his appearance in St. Petersburg, quote, he was reputed to have been sent to the Russian court as a secret emissary of Masonic organizations, unquote. The Empress believed in his superhuman powers. He arrived at the court just before the birth of the heir apparent, and the Empress placed all her maternal hopes in his supernatural aid. He left a short time afterwards, his unexpected departure giving rise to the rumor that those who had sent him to Russia were dissatisfied with their envoy and recalled him. Shortly after the departure of Philippe, a new prophet appeared in St. Petersburg, this time of purely Russian origin. Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian peasant who had assumed the guise of a pious Russian pilgrim. He made a very deep impression on the Empress. Those whose patronage had enabled him to gain a standing in St. Petersburg subsequently detected his true character, but tried to secure his removal from the court. But it was already too late. Rasputin had installed himself too firmly to be dislodged. Rasputin's influence over the Empress was primarily due to the intervention of Anna Vyrubova, who occupied a quite exceptional position at the court of Tsarsko Selo. Vyrubova's proximity to the Empress and the influence which she acquired in the imperial family was just as tragic a fatality as Rasputin's appearance at the court. The circumstances which brought together the Empress and Anna Vyrubova are very characteristic of both. Vyrubova at the time, Madame Tanieva, daughter of the chief of His Imperial Majesty's personal chancery, lay dangerously ill with typhoid fever. She dreamt that the Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna entered her room and took her by the hand. This was the turning point of her illness. Recovery set in, and she simply lived for the moment when she might be able to meet her illustrious protectress. The Empress, who had been told of this vision, and with her natural kindness wanted to please the sick girl, went to see her. And from this moment, Vyrubova's adoration knew no bounds. Of limited and undeveloped intelligence, but cunning, servile, and of hysterical temperament, Vyrubova was inclined to exaggerate her feelings. But the Empress believed in her sincerity, and touched by such exceptional devotion, after her recovery, brought her into close personal contact with herself. Vyrubova's unhappy marriage and subsequent breach with her husband inspired the Empress with sincere pity for poor Annie and strengthened her attachment to this trivial woman. The closest of friendships was formed between them. In all her subsequent actions, Vyrubova was guided by her instinct. In spite of her intimacy with the Empress, her psychology was rather that of a clever maid, seeking by every possible means to gain exclusive confidence of her mistress. While impressing the Empress with the certitude of her boundless devotion and blind and unchanging adoration, Vyrubova at the same time instilled into her a feeling of ill will towards all others who surrounded her. She would sorrowfully and indignantly assure her mistress that not only society, but even the members of the imperial family were unaware of the Empress's merits. She alone, Anna Vyrubova, worshipped her and could appreciate her majesty at her real value. In spite of her lack of intelligence, Vyrubova was not slow to realize that the more she was able to isolate the Empress, the greater would her own influence be as her one true friend. Her attachment to the Empress was undoubtedly sincere, but it was by no means disinterested, and she eventually wove a whole net of egoistical intrigue around it. A more suitable person could not have been found to bring Rasputin and the Empress together. It was easy for the astute starets, and there's a definition here of what a starret is. It's foreigners persistently style Rasputin either monk or priest. He was neither. The term starets was applied to him by his female admirers. In Russian monasteries, it is usually applied to monks who were held in special reverence on account of their holy lives. The faithful look to them for spiritual guidance, turn to them for advice in difficult moments, and supplicate them in prayer. Such staretsi were and are rarely found, but in few monasteries throughout Russia. They lead an ascetic life, practicing all forms of privation. Rasputin had nothing in common with them, so that's the reference there. It was easy for the astute starets to make the hysterical woman believe in his saintliness, so that she in turn might influence the Empress with his suggestions. But it was after Rasputin had acquired authority in the imperial family, and the Empress had come to believe him as a just and godly man, that Vyrubova scented the possibilities which lay before her. This insignificant person began to feel the lowest kind of craving for power. Her friendship with the Empress had already given her an exceptional position, but with the advent of Rasputin, her importance was increased. She became the Empress's most trusted confidant, the only intermediary between Her Majesty and Rasputin. It must be supposed that Rasputin, relying on Vyrubova as the most convenient tool at his disposal, in his turn encouraged the Empress to confide in her. It is difficult to believe that Anna Vyrubova, having become the center of Rasputin's influence and of his constant interference in state affairs, cherished any political designs of her own. Her intelligence was too limited for sustained thought, but she was intoxicated with playing the role of an influential person. The weaving of incessant intrigues, now giving support to one person, now withdrawing it from that. This juggling with power completely obsessed her. But Rasputin's influence in state affairs, through the agency of Vyrubova, did not immediately make itself felt. It was only after the emperor had elected to change his permanent place of residence from St. Petersburg to Tsarsko Selo that the restricted circles to which the imperial family was thereby confined made it possible for the starets to exercise his power. The Emperor Nicholas II was shy by nature. He avoided public appearances whenever possible and preferred a quiet life within his family circle. He became accustomed to this existence from his early youth. Let's see. Just want to check the sound there. Sorry. From his early youth, for the Emperor Alexander III had spent comparatively few years of his reign in St. Petersburg and had lived chiefly in Gatchina. But the prevailing conditions during the two reigns were far from similar. Stormy years had set in, and the emperor's withdrawal from the capital had almost had the most dire results. The Emperor Nicholas II did not seek wide intercourse with his subjects. His most frequent appearances were among his regiments of the Guard. He was chiefly acquainted with military circles. He carried on his duties as a monarch almost exclusively at Tsarskoe Selo, where his ministers reported to him. He worked hard and with great perseverance, but he did not see his country in close quarters, and his country did not know him. Only those who had access to the palace came face to face with a monarch who was extraordinarily fascinating, charming in the kindly simplicity of his ways, and full of an ardent love for Russia. The Empress Alexandra Feodorovna greatly encouraged him in this life of retirement. As time went on, she shunned not only St. Petersburg society, but even members of the imperial family. In the solitary surroundings of Tsarskoe Selo, the emperor shared his leisure hours with the empress. Intelligent, delicate in feeling, and exceedingly good natured, gradually and unconsciously he became accustomed in certain matters to subject his will to the firm, tenacious personality of his wife. She became his only friend, filling his life so completely that there was no room left for the influence of others. The empress suffered from a malady of the nervous system and from a serious neurosis of the heart. This affected her mental outlook and often clouded the atmosphere of Tsarskoe Selo. Her Her state of health alarmed and distressed the emperor, and still more confined his attention to family cares. But their greatest trial was the incurable illness of the long expected and only son, the Tsarevich Alexis. He was afflicted with hemophilia, a hereditary disease, passed to male members of a family through the female line. The empress, who was a tender and loving mother, suffered doubly. She was tortured by her constant fear for the life of the Tsarevich, and by the knowledge that she herself had handed down the illness to him. Efforts were made to keep his illness secret, but secrecy could not be indefinitely preserved, and it only encouraged the rumors of all kinds which were spread in society thanks to the solitary life of the emperor. A veil of mystery was thrown over the imperial family. Curiosity was aroused, ill will was engendered, and no one was led to imagine how deeply the parents suffered over their child, and in what constant anguish they spent their life. Such conditions offered a wide field of action to Rasputin. The empress blindly believed in his supernatural powers. She tried to convince the emperor of them. She believed that only a miracle could save her son. Rasputin managed to imbue her with the idea that he alone could perform this miracle, and that while he remained in close contact with the imperial family, the Tsarevich would remain alive and well. Later, she became convinced that Rasputin alone could save Russia, and that he was endowed with a higher wisdom and an instinctive knowledge of character with the gift of foresight. An atmosphere of unhealthy mysticism and lack of equilibrium pervaded the imperial family. This atmosphere grew more intense as time went on, and the emperor, at the side of the sick empress, with Anna Vyrubova and Rasputin in close attendance, found his daily life and routine completely enveloped in it. At times, he tried to resist the influence surrounding him. He went so far as to dismiss Rasputin, but he lacked the strength to fight to the end against forces which now appeared to have become a part of his life. The outbreak of the war seemed to disperse these clouds. A wave of patriotism swept over the whole country. Party differences were set aside, and all dissatisfaction with the supreme power was forgotten. The Tsar and his people were at one. But this national unity was of short duration. As the struggle dragged on, the clouds gathered again, and Rasputin reappeared like an evil genius at Tsarskoe Selo. Struggling along the high bare banks of the river Tura lies the village of Pokrovskoy. From the hill in the heart of it, where the church stands, the roads stretch away in all directions. They are laid out straight and are bordered with roomy peasant cottages. Everything seems to breathe prosperity. The streets are full of fowl. The farmyards abound with cows, sheep, and pigs, and sturdy little horses of local breed that look as if they are cast in steel. The cottage interiors are spotlessly clean. The wide window sills are bright with flowers. If you leave the village to stand for a moment on the banks of the Tura, You are confronted with the spaciousness of Siberia, a spaciousness of like which is probably not to be found the whole world over. Meadows and steppes dotted with birch groves stretch away into the distance, and beyond them lies the ermine, the endless forest of fir and pine. In the summertime, the ermine is strewn with berries of all sorts: raspberries, currants, red and black, and brambleberries. The forest clearings are carpeted with strawberries. The woods abound with game. The grasses and flowers grow almost to the height of man. No village can be seen for miles around. In Siberia, villages are few and far between. They are often separated by hundreds of versts. Towns are still more rare. The railway that runs through the municipality of Tyumen passes very wide of Pokrovskoye. In the winter, communication is maintained by road only. Wrapped in a heavy fur coat and a dogskin cape as well, the best protection from all from the Siberian frost, the travelers whirled along in a light sledge over the glistening snow-covered road, which stretches out like a silver ribbon before him. The swift horses do not know fatigue, and the passenger drowses, lulled by the monotonous tinkling of the sledge bells. The white plains flash by, the forest close in. Siberian cedars and fir trees tower above in gigantic columns, shaking down snow from their heavily laden branches. In the daylight, the bright sunlight on the snow is blinding. At night, there is the moon or the distant stars, and sometimes the bluish-green aurora of the northern lights will flash out across the sky, and all around seems fairyland. In the summer, boats ply along the Tura from Pokrovskoye to Tyumen. To the north downstream, the Tura runs to the Tobol, and the steamer carries you to Tobolsk, a small, dreary township far removed from any railway, but the administrative center of an immense province occupying the northwest region of Siberia. It was along the rivers of Tura and Tobol from Tyumen to Tobolsk that the Emperor Nicholas II and his family were taken into captivity in the summer of 1917. The steamboat passed by Pokrovskoye, and the Empress, who was told afterwards by one of those who voluntarily accompanied the imperial family, watched the shore from the deck and followed with fixed and melancholy gaze the slowly receding roofs of the peasants' cottages and the tall white church tower. It was in the village of Pokrovskoye that Grigory Rasputin was born and spent his youth. He left it to take up those wanderings which eventually brought him to St. Petersburg. The Siberians are a people of mixed origin. Chance brought their fathers and grandfathers into this rich and fertile country, just as a river's current will carry down pebbles and sand. In western Siberia live many old believers. They are of various persuasions, and they are settled in the forest and other inaccessible places. Their ancestors came here long ago to escape the persecution of the government. They strictly observe their ancient customs and lead godly and austere lives, zealously guarding the memory of their past and the books of divine service in their cumbrous bindings. But there are other inhabitants of Siberia, the descendants of fugitive and banished convicts. These try not to speak or think of the past. Whose business is it if the forefathers of some of them pass through the whole of Siberia in shackles? They are well off and independent. They have grown up in full freedom, out of the reach of all authority, and have not been accustomed to bow down to anyone. The Siberians are a bold people, rough, but usually very honest. They strongly disapprove of theft, and often take the law into their own hands to punish it. The only person whom they ever reproach with his past is the thief, particularly the horse stealer. There is a special Siberian term, varnak, which means vagabond, runaway thief, and they can use no worse insult. This was the very nickname by which, from his early youth, Grigory Rasputin was notorious in his village. The blood of his forebears showed itself in him from his birth. The son of a horse stealer, he continued in the same profession. This shameful and dangerous pursuit gave him scope for the exercise of his dexterity, his cunning, and rapacious instincts. More than once he was caught red-handed and thrashed within an inch of his life. On at least one occasion, the police arrived on the scene only just in time to tear his bleeding and mutilated frame from the heavy hands of the infuriated moujiks. Another man would not have survived such thrashings, but it was as if a blacksmith's hammer were beating on an anvil. Rasputin bore everything and only grew stronger from such treatment. The settled industrious life of a peasant could offer no attractions to his thievish nature. His instinct was to wander. He would often visit places distant from Pokrovskoy, sometimes disappearing for long intervals. During one of these prolonged absences, it was rumored that he had been converted and was living a strictly ascetic life in some remote retreat or in one of the distant monasteries. It is possible that somewhere in his restless soul, vague searchings had been awakened, and that for a time he had been genuinely drawn towards religion. But the pure teaching of the Orthodox Church was completely foreign to his nature. What really was likely to attract him was the obscure mysticism of the most perverted sects. No exact information could be found concerning the places which he visited in his wanderings or the people he met. All that is definitively established is that he often visited a certain Orthodox monastery occupied by sectarians who had been sent thither for correction and reform. The Siberian monasteries resembled large and prosperous estates rather than the cloisters of devout ascetics. The monks themselves, few in number, were engrossed in their everyday duties and did not pay much attention to the sectarians domiciled among them. Rasputin could, therefore, speak very freely with these dissenters. He could penetrate all their secrets while outwardly remaining a pious, zealous, and humble pilgrim. The immense dynamic force with which nature had endowed him could not fail to attract special attention. Like an Indian fakir, he could go without food or sleep, and in order to develop his willpower, he trained himself to such a pitch of asceticism by means of these ostensibly religious practices that at times his companions might have looked upon him as a saint, whereas in reality his soul was filled with an inscrutable darkness which that was purely of the devil. The sectarians looked upon him as a discovery, and in their own way greatly appreciated him. The Orthodox clergy also became interested in him, not suspecting that this fasting and pious supplicant was playing a double game. From the very outset, he had kept his sectarian leanings dark, and for his own private designs, he was careful to preserve an outward connection with representatives of the church. He succeeded in acquiring by rote a smattering of the Holy Scriptures and in absorbing a number of spiritual and moral precepts, and he trained himself to assume the guise of a man of God, of a starets, endowed with wisdom and spiritual insight. His marvelous memory, combined with exceptional powers of observation and assimilation, aided him in this respect. He could not at this time have any notion of his future career. He harbored no idea of going to St. Petersburg or even into European Russia, from which Siberians feel themselves cut off. Probably the idle and wandering life of a pilgrim attracted him for its own sake. It seemed pleasanter than the uninterrupted labor of the peasants at his home. His fate was decided by a chance meeting with a young missionary monk, a well informed, deeply religious man, as pure and as naive as a child. He believed in Rasputin's sincerity and presented him to Bishop Theophan, who, in his turn, brought the impostor to St. Petersburg. An ordinary peasant would have become confused by life in the capital. He would have lost himself in the intricate web of court, society, and official relations. No ordinary muzhik would have had the courage, particularly while everything was as yet strange to him, to show such ease and independence in such surroundings. Incidentally, the easy manner and familiar tone with which this former horse stealer adopted even towards the most highly placed personages was a very considerable factor in his success. Rasputin went in and out of the Tsar's palace as calmly and unconstrainedly as if it had been his own college at Pokrovskoy. This made a deep impression. People were apt to think that nothing short of real saintliness could cause a simple Siberian peasant to show no sign whatever of servility before an earthly power. But this muzhik was not slow to observe, remember, and turn over in his mind everything that was of use to him in the noisy and crowded capital. He almost flawlessly analyzed certain characters, quickly perceiving the weak points of those whom he desired to influence, and adapting himself to them. At Tsarskoe Selo, he appeared in the guise of a righteous man who had consecrated himself to God. In society drawing rooms among his female admirers, he was much less circumspect. And finally, at home or in private room at a restaurant, in the intimate company of his associates, gave full vent to his drunkenness and wanton debauchery. In certain, incidentally very small, circles of the highest ranks of St. Petersburg society, occultism of every kind was cultivated. People sought after thrilling sensations at spiritual seances and were drawn towards everything that was piquant and unusual in the realm of unwholesome mysticism. In this environment, Rasputin was assured of marked success. He tried to hide his connection with sectarianism, yet on coming into closer contact with him, people instinctively felt that, still deeper than his occult powers, there lay within him some other disturbing force which attracted them. This element was Chilisticism, with its intoxicating sensual mysticism. Chilisticism is essentially sexual in character. It is a blend of the coarsest animal passion with a belief in the highest spiritual revelation. In prayer meetings, the Chilists combine, in an intense degree, religious ecstasy and erotic abandon. The Chilists believe that at the height of their hysterical excitement, the Holy Spirit descends among them, and that the licentious union of the sexes, which is the customary end of their ceremonies, is nothing less than an act of God's blessing. Chilisticism is without doubt a survival of pagan times. The ceremony begins with a slow rhythmic dance, which changes to a mad whirl. There's a blinding glitter of candles in the room during prayer, and the inevitable climax is a wild, amorous debauch. It would seem that in the dark recesses of the national consciousness, there may still linger some feeling or memory of bygone times, which has taken the form of a sacrilegious distortion of the Christian faith. It is characteristic that the Chilists have never severed their official ties with the Orthodox Church. They attend the services, acknowledge the sacraments, and frequently partake of Holy Communion. Rasputin justified all his monstrous debauchery with typical Chilist reasonings, and sometimes instilled into women the belief that contact with him was far from being a sin. He went from house to house, overwhelmed by invitations. Some desired to see him out of curiosity. Others, especially in the early days, were interested by stories of his saintliness, while others, again, with a morbid strain in them, were at once infatuated by him. After he had acquired an influence in political circles, he was still more eagerly besieged. His good graces were sought, he was given presents and bribes, and he was wined and dined. His sojourn in St. Petersburg was one long holiday, one continuous debauch. Life had indeed changed for this one-time fugitive horse dealer. It was natural that in the end his head should be turned by the realization of his power, by the servility of those who surrounded him, by the unusual amount of money at his disposal, by all this undreamed of luxury. His cynicism passed all bounds. How could it be otherwise? Could he stand on ceremony with those who had waited in his hall, and with women who were ready to kiss with reverence his dirty hands? The more he felt his strength, the less he respected those who surrounded him. But his popularity was very restricted. He moved only within the limited circle composed by his female admirers, and of those persons connected with the government who needed his support. All the saner elements of St. Petersburg disapproved of him. Satiated with the debauchery and drunk with power, he degenerated and lost all perspicacity and prudence. His end was a fitting conclusion to the whole of his life. His body, which to the last had resisted both poison and bullet, was thrown into the waters of the Neva. The Siberian wanderer, who had set out on too venturesome a path, would have met with a similar end in any case. Yet had he met it in his native village, it is doubtful whether anyone would have troubled to search for his remains in the waters of the Tura. So I think I'll stop right there. That's the 50-minute mark. So thanks for listening. You can check out all my other shows, like I mentioned at the intro, in William Ramsey Reads History. That's where this will go. I don't know if I'll do the other ones in a live show, but I'll put a link to everything else. And as you can tell, this is really an interesting book. I made it to page 43 today, and there's about another 5 episodes in here, another 250 pages, but all the details are ring true. So I think that this book by Felix Yusupov is up. You got to take it with a grain of salt, but I think that his insights on the personalities and characters which led to this bloody revolution, to communism, to control of the great state of Russia, of the change, and the Red Terrors and the Cheka, and all these things are really, I think, have to be traced back to some of the events that happened between Nicholas II, his wife, and Rasputin. So thank you very much for listening.